We made this.
Hello, welcome to Right in the Childhood. This is Mark, and alongside me is my guest host, Dev. Say hello, Dev.
Hi!
So, we recorded our episode on Goosebumps as a kind of backup, really, for if Fraser was ever away and I needed it. But then Fraser's plans changed, and therefore the show's format changed. So, this is the first one of how we are going forward with Right in the Childhood. But we didn't know that at the time. So the way we talk on it seems like you're a guest when Fraser was a host rather than one of my guests. And it all gets very, very complicated, doesn't it?
It does, but it shouldn't be too complicated for you, the listeners, now. We're not talking Chucky per se, but it's us two talking horror, so you'll enjoy it.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. This is being posted on the Right in the Childhood feed on Wednesday and then onto the ChuckyVision feed on the Friday. That was never the intention. And it was just us recording because we had some time. We enjoy each other's company and we both like horror. But it felt like the right thing to do for both Right in the Childhood and for ChuckyVision was to just post it in the same month. So, yeah, I really hope you enjoy this Right in the Childhood. New format, but it sounds like something else. Oh, well. Hello and welcome to Right in the Childhood, the podcast about kids' TV, right here on the We Made This podcast network. My name is Mark and I am your regular host. And with me at this time, you're not Fraser.
We haven't even started the show, and I'm already spooked. we just did another we just did another podcast, and then unprompted we were like, let's do this one. So here we are.
Hello, Dev. Welcome to Right in the Childhood. Tell people about yourself.
Hi, I'm Dev. If anyone knows me via Mark, we host the ChuckyVision podcast, all about the Child's Play movies and the new Chucky TV series. That's been really fun. But here we are. I will say I am a fan of this show. It's a pleasure to be on this.
So the concept of the show is that Fraser and I we're both technically millennial, but we're both opposite ends of the millennial spectrum. I'm on the Gen X end and he is on the Gen Z side. And I always thought that if I was having guest hosts come along when Fraser's away or off being, I don't know, a fucking Ninja Turtle or dressing as Peter Pan or being in America or dressing as an elf or whatever the fuck he's doing, that I would use maybe a boomer or ask my friends with kids to pick one of their kids' shows or something, that would be a little bit of a different, but you're basically the same age as Fraser.
Yeah, Fraser's what, like 27 now? Or
he'll be around 27 by the time this airs. Yeah, he won't thank you for that.
Well, okay, I'm the same age of Fraser then. And I'm sure Fraser will be missing out on this episode. Fraser probably has a lot more familiarity with my show of choice than you do, apparently.
Well, I think he would never have put your choice of show on as an episode. Basically, yeah, because he's a massive fraidy cat, we would never have done the show you've picked. Dev, what show have we picked?
We have picked the 90s classic Goosebumps, which I love, which I guess goes against the premise of the show because I revisit my childhood a lot, so...
Oh, have you watched it recently then?
Like last year, I watched a bunch of it. So I know exactly how well this holds up.
Right, okay, well... Maybe don't mention that until we get to the second half where I've watched the stuff. But my experience of Goosebumps is that I was too old for it. The Goosebumps books were a spiritual sequel to a series of books that I did read as a kid, though, and they were called Point Horror. Point horror books were written by a number of authors, but the most prolific amongst them was RL Stine. So I was reading RL Stine in the early 90s with these point horror books. They were released 2 a month, and I would basically spend my pocket money on both of them, pretty close to the day they were released. I had damn close to the complete collection of point horror books, and I don't know what happened to them. I have searched my mum and dad's house, and they are not there. I wonder what the fuck I did with those.
Every child owns at least a couple Goosebumps books, which then disappear at some point.
True.
I think the Scholastic Book Fair, I think they just go around people's houses and take those books back to sell them.
But I was absolutely obsessed with the point horror collection. I wanted to get them all. I don't think I did, but I wanted to get them all. And they were aimed at a little bit of an older audience than Goosebumps were. They were aimed at, even though it wasn't really as much of it certainly wasn't the cash cow it is now, but it was a young adult teen audience. So the kind of young adults that would now be reading stuff like, I don't know, fuck's sake, Katniss Everdeen, what are the book's called?
I don't know what comparison to R.L. Stine there is these days. I mean, he's still churning out books. So I guess kids are still reading Goosebumps.
Yeah, they probably are, but point horror books are very much out of print. You can get them reasonably cheap on eBay, except they had like a massive spike in price when R.L. Stine's, the 3 series of horror films on...
The Fear Street ones.
The Fear Street ones, they were written by R.L. Stine. So his point horror books had a hike in price when that was released on Netflix.
I do wonder when point horror inevitably will get some treatment, because he never quite made the leap that R.L. Stine did, but Christopher Pike was also a renowned American writer of like children's horror. And his books are, well, at least some of them are getting adapted by Mike Flanagan.
He was a point horror writer as well, Christopher Pike.
Okay,
you seem to actually know point horror relatively. Oh, you don't know. You did. That was just a guess.
I'm vaguely familiar with point horror.
Did you ever read any?
Maybe as a kid, but I don't know them as well as I do Goosebumps.
Right. Okay. But how do you feel the kind of adaptation from the books to the series worked? Were they direct adaptations of the books, or were they more inspired by continuation of?
They were pretty direct, actually. There's like 60 books or so, or at least in the original run. He always did those like Goosebumps 2000 and stuff. Like he was always updating the titles, which, I mean, God knows what kids are reading these days. I don't know if they're reading the original books, but there was like 60 odd books, and the TV show did like 50 of them. So it it pretty much like, I don't think it was the same order, but it like pretty much adapted book by book. And then there were slight differences. Like, the endings might be a little bit different, or like characters might be a little bit different. But yeah, I mean, they're not long books, so you can adapt them into like 20-minute chunks without losing too much.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, what we normally do at this point is we normally do the pitch if we've never heard of the show, but I do know what the Goosebumps is. They're horror stories written for kids. I presume that they would be one-off stories. There's no real cliffhangers, or there might be a couple of 2-parters maybe. And yeah, just adaptations of the more kid-friendly version of point horror, I guess, would be my pitch.
Yeah, well, you make 2 interesting points then. One is that almost every book and every episode does end on a cliffhanger.
Oh, okay.
On a very deliberate, like, cheesy one. Like, oh, did we get rid of the monster? Uh-oh, maybe we didn't. So it's kind of a weird show because every ending does have, like, a dark ending. But then the other thing is, occasionally there would be, like, a really popular book. Like, Night of the Living Dummy was one.
Yep. I've actually even heard of that.
Yeah, it was essentially Chucky. It was like a child version of Chucky, just like a creepy ventriloquist doll that was alive and evil. And that got like very much like the books never seemed to do this, but like the Goosebumps books did, where it would just literally be called Night of the Living Dummy 2, Night of the Living Dummy 3. So he did like direct sequels.
Well, he also did that with Point Horror books. He wrote The Babysitter, The Babysitter 2, The Babysitter 3, and The Babysitter 4. All of which I'm sure you're not surprised by the fact that I read them all and loved them all. And even the really, really weird Babysitter 4, where the whole plot was the girl who has gone through incredible amounts of trauma is actually insane and it's just in her head. She's in an asylum.
Yeah, that seems tropey enough. Yeah.
Not only tropey, but fucking gross. RL Stine bad. Naughty RL Stine.
It's an odd thing then. I guess in a sort of way we do need to pitch these. Because it's like Fear Street is an odd one because those movies are very much like 18s. They're adult slashers. But like it's almost a meta hook to be like, this is R.L. Stine, but it's violent. And
Yeah.
Goosebumps is odd because it was horror and it did scare like younger kids, but then it was also kind of like corny and like silly. So like people wouldn't be too. It was never straight horror, so people weren't terrified. But it's an odd show. It was an odd, very sort of audacious pitch for that audience in the 90s.
Yeah, and I think I was possibly reading Point Horror just a few years earlier than I should be. And I think if my parents had been into books, they might have not been very pleased. Because I progressed from Point Horror straight onto stuff like Stephen King and James Herbert when I was like 13, 14. And they were gross, you know, like real horror kind of shit. The Fog, The Rats, Slugs by Sean Hudson, all of these books that I definitely shouldn't have been reading that young. But because my parents couldn't see what was on the telly, they were less able to understand and or censor what I was reading compared to what I was watching.
Yeah, I had Rats as a kid. I had that book.
How old were you when you read Rats?
Oh god, young. And yeah, I guess I was pretty blown away by how gross and scary that was at times.
Do you remember the sequel that was basically the same book? And then the third sequel, which was The Nuclear Holocaust Happened and Here Are the Rats. They were an odd series of books. I loved them. But I think Domain, the one where he'd established that the universe had giant rats and then had a nuclear holocaust and then the rats were the winners. That was my favourite. It was batshit crazy, but a lot of James Herbert is.
Yeah, that's it. Those are really interesting choices. And especially, again, with like Point Horror. I don't know how hard that went for the horror, but like, I don't know if a kid could go from Goosebumps straight into like Stephen King. Like, there's too much of a gap. Goosebumps, the books, are very simply written. They're very kind of cheap scares. I mean, literally, like, if we're talking cliffhangers, literally every single chapter would be like, and then Carly Beth went into her bedroom, and there was a cold hand on her shoulder, and then the very next chapter would be like, it was her brother.
Point Horror did that a lot. A lot. Yeah.
It was very cheap horror, but it was very shallow horror at the same time. So it was like a jump scare, but then it never really left the kids thinking too much about stuff.
What I think is peculiar is that surely the natural order of things would have been for Goosebumps to be a franchise and then have Point Horror as the sequel rather than the other way around. Because it almost feels like there's 10 years in between where kids got no horror books by R.L. Stine, Christopher Pike, Richie Chankersley-Cusick, and all the other writers that did the Point Horror stuff. It feels like Point Horror should still have existed and still be going, and almost like a sister publication to Goosebumps. But they were gone by the time Goosebumps appeared.
Yeah, it's odd who survives and who endures. I think the TV show of Goosebumps is a huge factor in why R.L. Stine got to keep writing.
True. Did it happen during the lifetime of the books? Were the books still being written when it came out, do you know?
Yeah, that was an interesting thing that you mentioned about missing the TV show, because the book started in 92 and the TV show started in 95. So the books,
Really? Good grief.
yeah, and so their timelines were pretty in sync. Like the books were an early success, and then they very quickly, after a couple of years, were like, "Let's start making a TV show of this."
So 95 was when I was in sixth form. So even point horror I'd slightly grown out of by that point. So I can absolutely see why I wasn't watching the teleseries. And maybe by 92, so I was 14 in 92. Again, I was already well into point horror and probably transitioning towards stuff like Stephen King and James Herbert at 14. So I can see why I missed the books and the teleseries, but not by much by the sounds of things. I thought it was a little bit later than that.
Yeah, oddly, it was much closer to you because in '95 I would have been 1, so
Wow.
I was not watching the show then.
Hmm. How old do you think you were when you were watching the show?
I want to say early on, like 10, 11 maybe, because it is aimed at younger kids. I probably got into it quite early.
So it was already quite old, though. So do you think you were catching repeats, or?
Oh, definitely. It would have been repeats on TV and stuff. And I think I had a couple of the VHSs. That is an odd thing with us. Like I know usually on this show, Frasier is mentioning stuff that came out in the 2000s, like Hannah Montana and Drake and Josh and stuff like that.
Hmm.
My childhood, my friend always gets annoyed when I say I grew up in the 90s because I did not. I was born in the 90s. I was just a baby for most of the 90s. But
Hmm.
growing up in the 2000s, I definitely grew up on a lot of 80s and 90s culture, like because I owned a lot of VHSs. And so I grew up on like the original Ninja Turtles and stuff, or the Hero Turtles.
Yep, but they're definitely the fucking hero turtles. Don't get that wrong. but I also had some 70s stuff in my childhood, like particularly like buying Doctor Who on VHS. I would buy the old Doctors because I was into the 80s Doctors, but not as much as it seems you had access to.
Yeah, well, as I say, like, I mean, a lot of what Frasier covers is like Nickelodeon and Disney and stuff. And for me growing up, I only had terrestrial TV, so 5 channels.
Right. It was 3 when I was growing up, you shit.
So for me, it was a lot of older stuff. Like, I mean, I grew up watching Classic Who, and that was because they were repeats on like BBC One and stuff. So yeah, I grew up on a lot of older stuff because that's just what that's just what the TV channels could show.
Yeah, true. I hadn't thought about that. But what I do find fascinating is that even talking to people of my generation, the shows that they are fond of aren't necessarily the same shows as mine. And it even goes as far as, I don't remember that, or I think I watched that, I just didn't get into it. So the sheer volume of stuff made for kids that some of it still has value is actually quite a lot.
That's something I really do love delving into. I'm like a culture hound. And it's the same reason I'm familiar still with Goosebumps and stuff is because I watch a lot of YouTube, and a lot of YouTubers I watch will revisit stuff like Goosebumps and revisit older shows and stuff. So, like, I watch videos like retrospectives on TV shows that like I never even saw. I never grew up with. I never saw at all. I'm just like, oh, this is a TV show from the 80s. That's cool. I mean, we talk about like old. Yeah, we talked about after Chucky, what other horror stuff we're gonna do, and we talked about like the Friday the 13th TV series, which went on for like 70 episodes, or the Freddy's Nightmare TV show, which went on for like 40 episodes. I mean, we had no idea those shows went on for so long, but people watched those when they were on TV. They were watching them every week, and that's like a weird moment of culture where like only people like us, I guess, delve back, rewatch and stuff.
Those two shows seem to have been completely forgotten. You can't access them anywhere, even if you pay on streaming services in Britain. And I wonder why there's so little value in, surely, every telly show that you can still get the footage of should be somewhere to stream and pay for. Even if it's on Amazon rather than Amazon Prime, where you actually have to pay £1 an episode, surely every television show that's ever been made, there is some value and some money to be made by getting them up on streaming services.
Yeah, it's very odd because it's like, again, like Doctor Who. I didn't really stick with it long enough to pay for it, but I got the trial for what's the BBC one? Not iPlayer. It's the
Do you mean BritBox?
BritBox. That's the one. Yeah,
Yeah, all of Doctor Who is on BritBox, yeah.
yeah. I watched all of the first Doctor. I watched all of that on there, and that's
That's
it's
a slog.
it was, but like I say, I'm interested in revisiting old stuff. So, but I mean, that is maintained. It's been restored and it's been presented really well for like people like me, just to see like, oh, there's an old show that people talk about. I'll just press play and give it a go. And yeah, like you said, there's a lot of older shows that I guess mainly for licensing rights. It's just like people are like, well, I mean, we could get the license for this, but let's just spend the money on something else,
I suppose you're right. I just kind of want to watch Freddy's New Nightmares and lots of other obscure horror.
Well, the Freddy one is interesting because I mean the Friday one was completely unrelated to the movies, but the Freddy one did have Robert Englund in it. It did have Freddy in some of the episodes, so there's definitely relevance and interest to revisit some of this stuff.
Mm.
I was going to say, there's one thing that we already mentioned, we already talked about before the pod, was Goosebumps. Goosebumps was on Netflix, all of it, but now
Right.
only like, and I double checked this because I thought, what is this season 2? Is this season 3? It's about half of season 1. There are just like 5 or so episodes missing.
How odd.
It's just a random selection of season 1 that's available on Netflix, and that's so bizarre.
Maybe it is something like licensing, like you touched on, because it does seem odd that a show that is that old, not all the episodes are available once someone's got the license for it.
Yeah, and again, like we've said, I mean, I would wager Goosebumps is just as popular, if maybe not more popular, than some of the more recent shows that have been brought up on this show. Like, I mean, how many people are talking about Drake and Josh these days, aside from, Drake Bell being in the news? But I mean, like the show itself, like how many people are still talking about that? Whereas Goosebumps, Goosebumps still has books coming out. It still has movies based on the books coming out. It's still culturally relevant.
Does it still have books coming out?
I think so. I think RL
Good
Stine is still
grief.
writing. I mean, RL Stine's one of those guys that he writes for other people. I saw that he wrote for Marvel at one point, like a couple of years ago. He just recently put something else out. He just write. He's like Stephen King. He does just write like every single day.
Yeah, his output is insane. Absolutely insane. You wonder how he switches his brain off. Maybe he doesn't. Incredibly prolific writer.
And again, it's so funny when you'll see that's a great thing. You'll see in some of these episodes. I don't know if he did it for all of them, but he intros some of these episodes.
Good grief! I didn't know that.
It's so funny because he's just such a gentle nerd. He's just like, "Hello, everyone. I'm RL Stine. This is Goosebumps."
Amazing. Right, I think what we're going to do is we're going to watch some Goosebumps. What episodes have you chosen for me, Dev?
I mean, there's so many good ones and there's so many memorable ones. 2 that are really sticking out to me are the first episode, The Haunted Mask, which fans of the show, everyone mentions The Haunted Mask. It's the first episode and it's probably one of the creepiest in the whole run. Other episodes get a bit too lame, but this one, it has some creepy visuals and I think it holds together as a story. And then right off the top of my head, I'm thinking of another one is Say Cheese and Die, which is an interesting concept, but then it's got some really cheesy acting in it by a fresh-faced Ryan Gosling.
Amazing. Okay, we're going to have a little bit of a break. We're going to watch some Goosebumps, which I never thought we'd do on this show. But yeah, we're going to watch some Goosebumps. See you in a bit. So we've just watched some Goosebumps, Dev, and we watched season 1, episode 1, The Haunted Mask, and season 1, episode 15, Say Cheese and Die. But like we said earlier, that is not what Netflix in Britain says. But that's what IMDb says, so that's what I'm going with.
Dun 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 dun. Yeah, we did. We watched some Goosebumps.
So, yeah. Let's. So I didn't hate it.
Honestly, that is the reaction. As someone who did not grow up on this show, that is kind of the reaction I expected.
It had a lot of good stuff going on, but it's really fucking naff, isn't it?
It is. I will say before we get into him in too much detail, I picked the pilot very specifically, even though it wasn't on Netflix, because I feel like that first episode is a notch above most of the other episodes.
Really?
Well, I feel in the comparison that I picked, this first episode and the second episode is noticeably more naff. And the rest of the show, from what I remember, is roughly in between these two episodes.
Okay. So, I'm just going to put it right out there. The acting isn't great, is it?
Okay. Before we go into detail, I think, yes, I agree completely. And I said so in the first part, that a lot of these Canadian actors are not great. I will say the only exception is the main character of Carly Beth in The Haunted Mask. I thought she is really good, and she elevates the episode. But as a whole, Goosebumps is not known for its acting.
It was campy and well done with Carly Beth. Yes, I think that's probably fair. But so, I want to talk about the RL Stine intro at the start. It doesn't add anything. It's just, why are you there?
So the pilot, which I think this is the first episode, Haunted Mask, you get the sense that they are trying a few different things in this. And the second episode, which is like episode 20 or whatever, that is very much the formula that they fall on. And I feel like one of those instances of, do we need a host? Do we need like a crypt keeper? And their version of the crypt keeper was a boring book nerd who wrote it.
You're so right.
The way he just comes in, he's like, I write the Goosebumps books. Wow.
It's just completely pointless.
I love how boring he is, though.
Which is fascinating when you think about the amount of books he writes, the amount of stuff he does. The fact that he is boring, yet he's got such a creative mind, is a wonderful contradiction.
It is. He does not come across as and again, he's a wonderful person, but he is also sort of a monster man, Stephen King. It reminds me of the trailer for the Stephen King directed Maximum Overdrive. And the trailer is just like no footage. It's just Stephen King himself, like with bizarre, like really harsh lighting. And it's just him in the darkness. And it's like, this is my new movie. It's going to scare the hell out of you. And this is not that at all.
No.
But I wonder if this was intentional then, because I would say this is one of the scarier episodes of Goosebumps. And I don't know if he was trying to downplay that. Like, don't worry, guys. Like, just sell in.
Maybe. I feel like the depiction of bullying in this was interesting. It felt exaggerated, but I think the exaggeration is kind of how it feels in your head. You do exaggerate it in yourself when you're being victimized, and when you're in a stressful situation, everything does seem worse than it is. So maybe that depiction is kind of right in a weird way. Does that make any sense at all, or am I talking absolute gibberish?
It does. It's a very interesting plot point of this, because if you want to hear us talk more in detail about bullying, the new Chucky series is quite similar in some regards. Especially in terms of the main character going from a good person like being steered into the dark side by an evil object whilst being bullied. Strangely similar.
Mm.
Not saying that.
Yeah,
Maybe
good point. Good point.
Don Mancini should have opened the first episode of Chucky. It's like, hi, I'm Don Mancini. I write the Chucky films.
No, he really shouldn't. Just a quick reminder that, we do a podcast on the Chucky franchise called ChuckyVision. That's why I've got you doing Goosebumps, really. I thought horror would be a
Equally
good
scary
thing.
TV shows.
Oh, dear. Equally scary. Get in the sea.
Yeah, no, the bullying in this is interesting. And one thing to note is that I think this was a two-parter and it's edited into one episode. This was like 46 minutes.
Yeah.
And the rest of the show is like 22 minutes. And I feel that does a great service to this story because we get more time with the characters. And so this idea of her being bullied and how it affects her is definitely, there's more time spent on it. So it's quite a bit more effective.
Yeah, the other one we watched did feel more rushed than this. And I think that's a general thing you see in kids' telly is it's either something like the Tripods, where it is desperately, desperately prolonged and takes forever, at least in Fraser's eyes, or something like Recess, where they cram an incredible amount into 20 minutes. And I felt like that is probably the strength of the, in inverted commas, 3 episodes we watched, that the Haunted Mask felt like it was paced right. And that it had the right amount of plot for the amount of time they had. And I think there was an element of the second episode we watched, Say Cheese and Die, being a little bit more rushed.
And as I say, I think Say Cheese and Die is kind of a good level for the show. There are better episodes and there are worse episodes. It's that thing about pacing and stuff, that as good as the first episode is, like, does every episode of Goosebumps deserve the 45-minute treatment? Because, I don't know, I mean, like, did we need more character work with this? Before, we won't get into it, but, like, does Say Cheese and Die need the same level of character depth as The Haunted Mask got? Or is this show for kids better at just a brisk pace? It's interesting the pace they were experimenting with in this first episode.
Yeah, that's probably true. And I do think that of the two, The Haunted Mask was the better of the two. But they're not, I mean, horror for kids has always been something that, since I've been an adult, I've not really been interested in, even though I was massively into horror for kids when I was a kid, And I guess the natural progression to horror, I don't know, let's say compare something like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which is aimed at teenagers, to, let's say, the originals, or Ultraviolet, which is vampire fiction aimed at adults. There is less of a jump from Buffy to Ultraviolet than perhaps there is from Goosebumps to Chucky. And I don't know. I think it's because this is aimed at even younger that I'm finding it difficult to just kind of smile and nod at Goosebumps.
It is an odd thing. I'm glad I'm getting your reaction, the reaction that it is, because I don't know. I mean, am I connected to this show too much? Like, can someone who didn't grow up with Goosebumps enjoy this show on any level? As just even
I didn't
as
hate it.
Like, that's what I mean. I'm not expecting you to like engage emotionally with it, but like just as a fun bit of spooky naff. Like, can you just enjoy it as that?
I've seen much worse adult horror films than this. Stuff that is just not only unwatchably bad when it comes to visual effects, but the plot is just as crap. So I could watch this. I don't think I would prioritize watching it, but I could definitely carry on watching this.
I guess that's what I was saying before about the length. I feel like if every episode had the attention that the first episode got, then it might be easier for adults to go back into.
What do you think you're going to do with this? Do you think you're going to rewatch more now that we've done this show, or?
Yeah, probably. I mean, as I said,
Duh.
this was not a show that just to break your format of the podcast. This is not a show that I left in my childhood. This, like a lot of stuff, is
Right.
something that I check it out now and again. Usually it's when either something reminds me of Goosebumps, or if it's near the Halloween season, or I mean, like the Goosebumps movies. The last one, Goosebumps 2, was a while ago. But when Goosebumps comes up in the news, I'll find an excuse to watch some Goosebumps.
So I felt like there was a plot line about how the mask and the outfit were so scary that people couldn't look at her. I didn't quite feel like the mask and the outfit was as scary as it needed to be for the way people were reacting to it.
People did find it terrifying. There were shots of trick-or-treaters in the street, like a street full of trick-or-treaters all running away in a mass panic, and it wasn't that scary. It was probably online.
No, the outfit wasn't that good.
I still like it. I think I think for young kids, that the range of masks in this they're a good level of intense. They're not super kiddish, but they are creepy enough for kids.
Maybe. Sorry, I think I want to go back to talking about bullying and stuff.
Yeah, because there is quite a bit. There is actually a surprising amount of scenes before the spooky stuff even happens.
Yeah, which is what we were talking about before, with the pacing being right. But the thing that got me was that it felt like the bullied girl's behaviour, her subsequent bad behaviour, could be blamed on what had happened to her. But I think it also emphasised that it doesn't excuse it, and that it emphasised that even if you're doing bad stuff because bad stuff has happened to you, it's still bad stuff, and you'll eventually have to deal with the fact that you've done bad stuff. And I thought that was actually really nicely done. I felt like as giving kind of like kids a moral, as like a message of it. I thought that was actually pretty strong.
Yeah, there is a strong thematic journey that she goes on in this. And that is definitely something that I think would have served the rest of the show better if they had really harnessed that. Because, again, compared to the Say Cheese and Die, there isn't really any thematic journey that the main character goes on. Like, he accidentally steals something, he uses something that he shouldn't have, and then he regrets it, and then he takes it back. And that's kind of it for his journey.
Which in 20 minutes is actually kind of okay.
Yeah, it's fine. It's it's good fluff, but I feel like this pilot was the people involved in this pilot were aiming for something a bit deeper, which is admirable.
And later on, you get the bullies, when she confronts them, they actually open up about what their motivations were, and that felt pretty real as well. I do feel like the analysis of bullying and explanation of how and why it can sometimes happen was more sophisticated than I was expecting it to be.
Yeah, there's a surprising amount of attention put on it. And I want to say, we talked about the acting and stuff in this. There are some high caliber actors. And I don't know if she's done much. I don't know if she's one of those kid actors that ever went on to do anything. But I feel like the character of Carly Beth, played by Catherine Long, I thought she did a really interesting job with this, because, as the dialogue says, her friend is like, "You're just afraid of everything." And that could have been it. But and, again, I don't want to give this show too much credit, but as someone who has suffered with, real anxiety, that's what I was getting from Carly Beth in this. That,
yeah,
she wasn't just a scaredy cat. She was genuinely suffering from anxiety. And at that age, that is quite an intense thing to see.
Yeah.
There are moments where she doesn't just get spooked and then is like, "Oh, that was scary." She has proper breakdowns in this. where she
Yeah.
emotionally can't deal with what's happening.
Yeah. That's actually a very good point.
And that really serves the plot in a really engaging way because it makes her more susceptible to the haunted mask, and it makes her more
Mm.
susceptible to turn her hatred outwardly. And I think that
Yeah.
definitely it makes this more interesting episode than what Goosebumps usually pumps out.
Yeah. I mean, so I don't want to devalue your own experiences, but did you feel that perhaps because, in a similar way to how gay people might like implicit gay storylines because that's all they have, do you feel like someone who's had anxiety in the past, you've almost put the anxiety onto Carly Beth there as a just trying to find something that represents you?
I think to maybe to a degree I'm reading into it, but I do feel her as someone who has seen quite a lot of this show. And you yourself, we watched part two.
Hmm.
I feel there is a distinction in acting quality. In part two, it's a lot of surface level acting. Like, just, I mean, God, we're gonna destroy the actors and say she's die. That's some very bad acting. But, she's
Hmm.
definitely a mark of, and to say, like, oh, she as an actress is intentionally putting all this in, I think she's just, like, really playing it up. Like,
Yeah.
as a young actor, she's really putting the effort in. So I think,
Yeah.
yeah, maybe it's not so much that like the show itself is trying to say that she has like anxiety, but that her performance, like it's a good performance, I feel.
Yeah. And I think as you look for representation of yourself in television, even if you find it where it wasn't intentionally done. I still think it's important, and even if it's a coincidence, that it's nice to have it, right?
Definitely. And I feel like again, like in a lot of this show, the representation is mainly just, oh, I was a boy once. I had a I you know, or like in Carly Beth, it would just be like, oh, I was a little girl once. I had a younger brother that like, or I was bullied. Like
Hmm.
it's very surface level representation in the rest of the series, pretty much. It's a show for kids,
Hmm.
and so the characters are kids, and then the kid audience can relate to that. That's about it.
Yeah, and the ending was pretty grim, I thought.
Well, I mean, every ending, as we've seen from two episodes, most Goosebumps end on like a little twist.
Yeah. So you feel like that kind of set the scene for the general gist of how Goosebumps would become.
I think they definitely put all the. I don't want to say they put less effort into the show, but I think they put all their effort into this because I think they were experimenting with, because this is a horror anthology for young kids, and I feel like they had a good idea of what it was going to be, and then this went out maybe when this came out, because I saw
Hmm.
online apparently like this got big numbers when it came out, like it was a big hit. And I think maybe quite quickly on, the studio was like, or the channel was like this is good, but tone it down just a little bit. So the rest of the series is a
Right.
bit more cartoonish, as we see in Say Cheese and Die. And it would have been
Right.
interesting to
Yeah.
see if it kept at this level.
What were the books like in comparison? Were they more grim, or were they about the same level of cheese?
I think that they, as I remember, they kind of got at these elements. It's like I'll talk about anxiety. Like you could probably read into maybe some of the characters having a bit of depth, but it wasn't necessarily like explicit. RL Stine wasn't writing about characters' emotions and stuff. It was
Right.
more in line with like say Cheese and Die. Like, hey, I'm Carly Beth, and I have a little brother, and I'm bullied, and it's pretty much like that.
Right. So I think the point horror that I was reading kind of wildly fluctuated between nearly as campy as Goosebumps and really quite dark, borderline adult fiction. That would be something I would say would be a fair criticism of the point horror books, was they never quite got the exact right tone. But again, that might be because it was explicitly aimed at teenagers. And like we said earlier, some of the stuff aimed at teenagers these days is fucking grim.
I would say definitely this episode has stronger horror elements than
Yeah.
I think. I wouldn't say almost every episode. A lot of episodes have at least one moment where it's like, ooh, that could be really creepy or spooky towards kids. And this episode I felt had a lot more. It was a lot more consistent in terms of like visuals and ideas that would creep kids out.
Right.
Especially like the slow evolution of this mask, like slowly taking over Carly, and like that bit when she tries to take it off and it's merged with her skin.
Yeah.
That's a scary concept for kids to wrap their heads around.
Yeah, and I think the merging with the skin was real horror. It doesn't necessarily need to be blood, guts, and gore to be real horror, real kind of like, oh shit, kind of shiver down the spines kind of stuff. And I thought that was really exceptionally well done.
Yeah, and maybe you weren't as spooked out by them, but it still gets me to a little degree. The
Yeah.
90s level effects of when all the masks come to life.
Yeah. It's kids' TV. And I think we should be praising the ambition of bringing these stories alive on a kids' TV budget. But yeah, the special effects were not good.
To me, though, strangely, I find the ropey 90s TV effects to make it spookier. If they, I don't know. I mean, they could do this like now, and it would probably be look a lot more realistic. But I don't know. The fakeness of it really gets to me in an artificial way. I don't know why. Like the blurriness of it and the blue, like the way the blue screen gives it just a weird look. Maybe it's the fact
I
that
can,
like, but when you see that first shot of when she goes up to the haunted mask, and the shot of it is it's very clearly a blue screen element posted in. I feel like part of my brain notices that, and then it's like, oh, something's going to happen with this mask. Something is going to happen.
yeah, I can see that. And I can see how, obviously, it's going to be easier for a kid to suspend their disbelief because, there's still very popular kids' films that are clearly outdated, that are still considered classics and kids will watch. But yeah, I think you can, to some extent, forgive ropey effects because it's for kids, or at least ropey effects from the 90s.
Yeah, you can figure it. And I don't know. I feel like I can't say I'm scared by this still, but I don't know. It
No.
unsettles me. As an adult, it unsettles me to a weird degree. Just seeing all the little eyes, in the masks.
Were you scared as a kid? Genuinely?
I can't imagine myself like jumping behind the sofa, like scared of this show.
Hmm.
But I like as I say, this episode, I think particularly this episode, I've watched more than I have like the show. This is not a show that I like go into and then just watch episode after episode. This is one of those.
Right.
This is like an episode that I've seen more times than any
Right.
other episode, and I feel like it's like it's the same level of like Doctor Who. Like when Doctor Who wants to scare the children watching, it'll have like a jump scare moment or something that affects that,
Yeah.
like scares people, and that's what Goosebumps is mainly. It's like fun jump scares, whereas this has more unsettling scares, like the mask merging with her skin, or when she's looking in the mirror and she's like, "Those aren't my eyes. Where are my eyes?" It's moments like that
Yeah.
that as a kid, it's like it sinks in, and it's like, oh god, this is like weird, and like, whoa, what's going on? Those are like the feelings I remember with this episode.
Hmm. Yeah, maybe you could compare it to Doctor Who in a kind of fun to be scared kind of way. Yeah, okay, I'll give you that. Last thing I've got to say about the episode, though, is I wonder if they really were RL Stine's parents.
Maybe that's why he stopped doing the openings. His parents just couldn't stand another episode. And he was like, look, I host it with my parents or I don't host it at all.
Maybe. Right, I think we'll move on to Say Cheese and Die, which was season 1, episode 15. So this was actually the first time I got to hear the theme tune, because the first one, because it was kind of a pilot, didn't use the theme tune.
No, it didn't.
Yeah, I thought it was kind of thematic and suitable, and yeah, it got it right, I think.
Okay, I mean, if we're going to talk about right in the childhood and like our childhood memories, this is one of the greatest TV themes of all time. Like,
Oh, please.
not just kid themes, one of the greatest themes of all time.
It was thematic and suitable. It wasn't one of the greatest TV theme tunes of all time. As if you can say that when you probably watch the X-Men cartoon.
It's up there. It's up there with the X-Men cartoon.
No, rubbish. It is acceptable.
You've only heard this theme once. Like, this theme gets burnt into your brain. This is like, to me, hearing those notes, that dun 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 dun, that is like the Winter Soldier code in Captain America. It activates my Halloween mode. I am instantly in the mood for spooks when I hear that theme.
Fine. And I think this is fascinating that when I've discussed TV themes with Fraser, the ones that send a shiver down my spine, he's like, meh. And the ones that excite him, I'm like, yeah, that was fine. And it's fascinating that the affection and the attachment genuinely does seem to grow over time. I don't think there are many X-Men themes that you're just, listening and for the first or second time and go, wow, that's a theme tune, you know?
True, yeah. And I don't know about any of the like new Goosebumps or whatever, whether or not they kept the theme. I'm trying to remember. Did the movies even use the theme tune? They must have at some
I
point.
don't know.
People would have rioted if they didn't reference the theme tune in any way. Have we said, just as an aside, how weird the movies are? Jack Black plays...
I've not seen the films.
Jack Black plays RL Stine in those movies.
What?
Obviously, they were...
Why doesn't RL Stine play him?
RL Stine is in the movies. He cameos. Those are some weird movies, though. Those movies don't try to adapt anything directly. They're weird movies, but they are fun.
I probably won't watch those.
Like, on the level of Jack Black, though, we have a very recognizable face in Say Cheese and Die. We have Ryan Gosling.
Ryan Gosling.
That's also another trope of this show. It's not star-packed, but there are a lot of recognizable faces. I think it's mainly Canadian-American actors. There's a lot of young faces in this show.
The idea of Ryan Gosling being in Goosebumps just makes me smile.
And he does not quite get the material that Carly Beth got.
No. But, I don't know, the storyline makes sense, and it's kind of tropey horror, and that's fine for a kid's show. One thing I did spot was a pattern amongst both of the episodes, is that basically kids behaving badly and suffering for it is quite a regular thing, not only for antagonists, but also protagonists as well.
Yeah, probably not something that R.L. Stine moralizes over too much, but yeah, I think to him it's just more of a plot device, isn't it, to get kids into trouble. Is it too scary then? The idea if the characters are just good characters, then if bad stuff just arbitrarily happens to them, do you think that's too scary for kids, isn't it? Really?
Potentially, yeah. But I think generally horror doesn't tend to have morals. It has tropes, but I don't feel like there's a message in if you have sex, you're going to die. It's just a trope, whereas it felt like with Goosebumps, there was still an element of adding some morals into the stories.
Yeah, which maybe gave R.L. Stine and maybe gave the TV show some leeway in being a horror for kids. At least the parents could be like, well, they're sort of learning something. Yeah. It's not just horror for horror's sake.
Talking about classic horror tropes, there was the not being believed when something supernatural happens.
Yeah, that does happen quite a bit. That's an odd point from the first episode that I rarely ever comes up in later ones, when someone says they're going to call the police. And that's a weird dose of reality, because as we see in Say Cheese and Die, it's very much like this kid is going on his own little adventure. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's isolated from the world of reality.
Yeah, and the point horror books, I know I keep going back to them, but that was my experience. But the point horror books were like, why didn't you phone the police? Next chapter, why didn't you phone the police? Chapter after that, you should have phoned the police by now.
But then there are police in this. But they're more
There are.
cartoonish police in this, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think, unfortunately, once you get the police involved, it does sometimes overcomplicate what needs to be a simple story.
Yeah, because there's parents in the first one, and those parents are like that's part of the storyline, that the parent, parental love and all that. Whereas here, the parents are more just sort of like a plot point, like we got a new car, let's take it out. That made me laugh when they're at the dinner party, not dinner party,
Yeah.
when they're at dinner, and the dad's just like halfway through dinner, he's like, "Let's go drive, come on."
I mean, I think that's a more real depiction of an adult than perhaps they intended, because I've learned as an adult, most of us are just big fucking kids. And the other thing I've put in my notes about this episode is I have never known so many people who want their photograph taken. Most people are like, don't take a photo.
I wonder if that's a 90s thing with like disposable cameras and stuff. I wonder if that's something RL Stine was trying to get on the zeitgeist of. That, like, oh, you can take photos like all the time now.
Yeah, true. Which I think was just about... No, it wouldn't have been just about starting. I think it was early thousands when phones really started having cameras in them.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great 90s thing of this. None of these kids have phones.
Yeah, exactly that. Because they wouldn't. There was one bit that I wanted to mention that nudges on what I refer to as 90s ick, where people in like tribes outside of the US are referred to as primitive when there's a reference to their fear of having photographs taken because they believe it takes part of their soul. I think we'd probably use maybe indigenous instead of primitive these days if we were being a little more sensitive. But it doesn't feel too grim compared to some of the shit on a rewatch of old stuff that I've had over the last few years podcasting.
Yeah, it's more of just an aside for like that. And that is something I've heard before. I've heard it towards indigenous people of like America, and maybe it originated there. And I don't even know how true that is. That might have been like a specific account of like one tribe, and then it's just been assumed from all, like you said, like quote unquote, it's just been applied to all quote unquote primitive people.
Yeah.
It's used more as just a storytelling device in this, isn't it? And only a brief one. I'm trying to remember. That
Yeah.
is something that I don't remember about this show. Aside from brief mentions like that, I don't think Goosebumps is problematic as a whole. I don't think it ever gets that culturally deep, really.
Yeah. There's some very bad parenting and some questionable 90s attitudes towards women from the male characters in quite a lot of point horror books. There's a lot of male entitlement as the norm and not as a bad boy and not as a bad character trait in some of the point horror books. But it is what it is. 90s gonna 90s.
Yeah, I feel like Goosebumps gets away with most of that. Generally, I find generally in Goosebumps, as far as I remember, unless it's like a specific story element, like girls and boys are pretty much interchangeable. Kids are just kids in the show.
Which I think is a good way to do it.
Yeah, like the girl being the girl doesn't really play into the story of this
No.
at all, does it? She's just a third character.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And I think that's probably the level of sophistication that we can expect from something from the 90s. I think you're right. Yeah.
She does sort of randomly come in, like near the end. That is such a obvious, like, weird bit of exposition. The fact that she disappears, but then she comes back and she gives all that exposition of like, oh yeah, I came back. I don't know why, but then I heard from a secondhand account that you thought this camera is haunted, so I came over to help you out. What?
Yeah, I think that's, again, is limited to 20 minutes. You have to just exposition quite a lot.
Yeah, it was odd.
I'll tell you one thing I did like, and it was quite unusual in as much that in kids' fiction, you get quite a lot of creepy guys in the background that aren't trusted by the main protagonist who then end up being very, very important and save the day. The creepy guy in the background here was actually the baddie. And because I'd seen the other situations so many times, I was expecting him to like actually kind of face turn. And he didn't. He was just a bad guy. I was like, okay, that works. I liked that.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember how often that happens in this show, because we do get the inverse of that in the first one, that the old bad guy is not really a good guy or a bad guy. He caused these events, but now he's trapped within them. So you get a bit of
Mm.
character with him. And then, yeah, this guy, I just kept thinking of, I mean, I kept thinking of this guy as Brent Spiner. Do you remember him in Independence Day? He looks like Brent Spiner
I
in
mean, I
Independence
remember
Day.
him as Data.
Well, in Independence Day, he has like long white hair, and he's also kind of crazy in
Right.
that. So he reminded me of that. But then, yeah, then he is just sort of crazy in this. It's kind of a weird turn at the end of that, isn't that? Where he gives his little sympathy story about accidentally creating this camera that causes bad events. And then he's
Mm.
like, I can't let you leave. And I would have thought that, I'm going to take a photo of you, so something bad happens to you. But no, he's just going to kidnap these two children. That's a bit suddenly serious.
Yeah, he's also a bit inept as well. When you think he could have just took a photo.
No, he immediately falls off the stairs. No, wait, no, he
Yeah.
doesn't. He fell off the stairs earlier. And then in this one, he gets a photo taken of him, which doesn't track with the logic of the entire episode because he just disappears
No.
into the camera.
Yeah.
That didn't make any sense. That was pretty rushed.
Yeah. Dear. Yeah. But I had a lot of fun watching this show, and I'm glad that you brought it because I think as a horror fan, as someone who's very much into adult horror now, having a little retro look back on what might have got me into horror if I was a little bit younger is genuinely fascinating.
Yeah, it's an interesting show because I wonder how easily you could browse the show with this, but it covers a lot of because it feels like a kid version of like the Twilight Zone or a kid version of Tales from the Crypt. And I
Mm.
remember it doesn't crib, but there's a lot of episodes in this that are similar to like Twilight Zone episodes. And
Right.
I wonder if that's maybe the best way for someone like you to browse Goosebumps by what the episodes are about, because there's a lot of different, there's a lot of different horror stories within this. Like you got your living dummies. There's like an
Yeah.
episode where a kid has like a magical TV remote that like affects reality. You've got episodes where kids there's a good one where kids visit like a London dungeon kind of thing, but then they go back in time and they're in the dungeons. There's interesting stories.
Would you credit this as a strong influence on what got you into horror as an adult?
Yeah, probably, yeah. And I would say definitely the first episode, which had that lingering horror. A lot of this
Mm.
show is probably closer to Say Cheese and Die in terms of cheap scares. Whereas
Yeah.
I think that first episode really stands out on its own.
Yeah. It's kind of, well, it's not feature length, but it's longer than. Maybe it's an unfair advantage if it's a two-parter, because there were some other two-parters, weren't there?
There were, yeah. And there's definitely sequels and stuff. There is a Haunted Mask Part 2, which is pretty good. It's okay. It's strangely, one of the characters is one of the bullies. So he
Okay.
becomes like the protagonist. Then he gets another haunted mask. And I remember that being kind of creepy,
Interesting.
but I don't know how it would hold up against the first part. That's another
Hmm.
show I'm thinking of, and I don't know how much you've seen of it. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark? No, Are You Afraid of the Dark? That's it.
No, never heard of it.
That's an American one. Well, American-Canadian one. It didn't quite make the jump over here. But I remember the scares in that show only a tiny bit, but a tiny bit more scary than it was in Goosebumps.
Right.
And I feel like that
Hmm.
show hit the tone or continued the tone that the first episode of this Goosebumps did. Whereas Goosebumps after this went a bit more child-friendly.
Right. Interesting. I could see myself occasionally, if I've not got something I'm binging at the time and I just need something on for 20 minutes while I iron a shirt or something, I could see myself chucking on another Goosebumps. I could. But I don't think it's one that I will immediately go, well, that was amazing. I'm going to binge watch this. It was great. But it was fun and I did enjoy it. And I'm really pleased that you shared this with me because it does give me an insight on where you came from as a horror fan compared to what I did, which, you know, as we do a horror podcast together, that's kind of nice. And I'm glad I invited you on. So thank you. Thank you, Dev, for sharing that with me.
Oh, this has been so much fun. And as I say, I've re-explored Goosebumps quite a bit, not just in my childhood, but yeah, mainly the first episode really, and then a few other episodes. This was definitely fun to revisit that as a whole. So yeah, I think I didn't quite break the format of your podcast. It still worked on me.
No, you got it right. Dev, where can people find you on the internet?
People can find me if you search Twitter at Absolute Travesty. I've got my little link tree or whatever, of different things. I'm going to be trying to start up my Twitch at least semi-regularly, and then I also do podcasts and stuff. I do ChuckyVision with the man right here, Mark Adams. We do
that would be me.
We do ChuckyVision, talking about all the Chucky stuff, and then I'm just guesting on other shows and stuff. So just look on my Twitter. Keep an eye out. I'll be popping up every now and again.
Well, thanks again, Dev. It's been a pleasure having you as a guest on this. I don't do it very often because the whole point was that Fraser and I hang out and watch kids' telly. But when he's not here, it's good to know that potentially I've got friends that can do a good enough job replacing that situation, you know?
No, yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is, I do enjoy...
I'm not sure that was as much of a compliment as I intended it to be.
Well, I actually do, I really do enjoy the show, and I enjoy both you and Fraser. I would love to do a podcast with Fraser at some point, because...
He will not come on ChuckyVision. I've asked him and he's absolutely refused.
But I like this show, and I like the both of you.
No, it's been brilliant having the same format, but with somebody else. You know, I've really enjoyed it. So thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for listening to Right in the Childhood. And I think we're going to be doing more guest host episodes in future, depending on whether or not Fraser is anywhere near a computer or near Manchester. But so until next time, thank you very much, and we'll see you then.
Dun, 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 dun.
Right in the Childhood is a podcast brought to you by the We Made This podcast network. You can follow the show on Twitter at RITCpod. The show's creators were Mark Adams and Fraser Summers. The show's host is me, Mark Adams. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at MarkAdamsHC. The show's logo was created by Carl Bryan, and the theme tune was composed and performed by Colin Jackson Brand. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed being hit.
Hello everyone, this is Tony, Network Chief of We Made This. As you know, our podcast network brings together a brilliant assortment of talent who talk about all kinds of pop culture content, such as the episode you just listened to. We're not going anywhere, but we'd love to keep the lights on for even longer if you're able to support our network on Patreon. For just £2 a month, you get your name in lights and the satisfaction of knowing you're helping us produce more great audio. And for £3 a month, you'll get your name in lights, but you'll also get access to an exclusive bi-monthly podcast from the We Made This talent pool on podcasting, pop culture, and, well, you tell us. We'll take your suggestions. For less than the price of a coffee per month, you can help keep We Made This going. Just head to patreon.com/We Made This. That's patreon.com/We Made This. And get the ball rolling. Elsewhere on We Made This. Shipwrecked and Comatose, a Red Dwarf podcast.
I think it's incredibly embarrassing that this sitcom was released 10 years after series 1 of Red Dwarf and looks significantly more shit.
Yes. I mean, it's blatantly obvious from the off that they've got the ship set and they want to use it as much as possible. But you can also see the quote-unquote sky behind them has got material creases in it. And it's blatantly a sheet.
Toss a Coin, a Witcher podcast.
Awesome. And what it reminded me of, all right, I'm going to show you my age here for a second, is a combination of Game of Thrones and, if any of you guys remember back in the decades even, Hercules: The Legendary Journeys. Everybody remembers that. It reminded me of just Hercules just slaying monsters, fighting gods, and having this dork of a sidekick by his side at all times, who's also a good fighter, but who's also very
goofy.
ChuckyVision.
I didn't find the original Mike particularly likeable, whereas this Mike really liked him.
It really only comes into play like in the second half of the story. The first half, it's really not a factor that he is a policeman. Whereas in the first film, I don't think he even needed a name really. You could just call him detective. That was his role in the first film.
I do feel like that's a fair cop. See what I did there? It's a pun! It's a pun, Dev! I couldn't resist, and I'm not sorry.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network.